In 50 BC, the eastern neighbor of the Roman Republic became the vast Parthian kingdom, which had arisen back in the 3rd century BC on the territory of the Seleucid state. The border between the great powers was established along the Euphrates. Mesopotamia belonged to the Parthians, and to the west of it was Syria, which had now become a Roman province.
We must secure the northern path in Gaul for the legions to advance.
My legions are ready. We strike swiftly. Agreed. Glory awaits us.
They dreamed of leading roles in the state, new conquests, and glory. At first they competed with each other, then agreed to act together, creating an alliance of 3 men. The general was considered the greatest commander of his time. Pompey was considered the greatest commander of Rome. It was he who ended the Sertorian War, defeated the pirates, subdued the Gauls, and added enormous territories to the possessions of the state. The general could boast only of the defeat of the rebellious slaves led by a notorious figure from history. But that was back in the distant 71 BC. In 55 BC, having received control of Syria, he immediately departed there. He had recruited in Italy. Joining them with those that were stationed in Syria, he obtained a powerful army of 10 legions and 5,000 cavalry. With such forces, Crassus intended to march against Parthia and, reaching India, lead. With such forces, the general intended to march against distant territories and, reaching new land.
The eagles of the empire, in the footsteps of legendary conquerors, surpassing all who came before and after.
Crassus decided with one blow to surpass both colleagues in the Triumvirate and take the leading position.
In the year 54 BC, the Romans built a bridge across the Euphrates and, without resistance,
Cities in northwestern Mesopotamia, one after another, went over to his side. The fact was that the population of these cities, founded by Alexander and the Seleucids, saw in the Romans a kindred people and greeted them as liberators. But immediately afterward, he made his first major mistake. The general made his first major mistake. Instead of advancing further and occupying Babylon and Seleucia, he went into winter quarters, leaving in the occupied cities garrisons of 7,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry. Thus he gave the enemy time to properly prepare for the military campaign of the coming year. During the autumn and winter, the Roman governor occupied himself with his favorite business, extorting money from the inhabitants of the province. The leader did not shy away from greed. That same year, envoys from a distant kingdom arrived in the ancient city.
If the army is sent by the Roman people, then the war will be cruel and irreconcilable.
But if the Roman leader had taken up arms against the Parthians and seized their lands for his own, benefit, then the Parthian king would refrain from war and release the Roman soldiers.
What guarantee would you provide for this peace?
We offer the solemn word of the king and the immediate release of the captured soldiers.
The commanding figure immediately asked what assurance they would give. The head of the delegation laughed and, stretching out his hand palm upward, said, The head of the embassy laughed and, stretching out his hand palm upward, said, "Hair will sooner grow here." Soon reports began to reach the commander about numerous partner attacks on the Roman garrisons left in the cities of Mesopotamia.
Soldiers arriving from there told terrible stories. They had seen with their own eyes how it was impossible to escape from pursuing Parthians.
We barely made it out alive!
Crassus firmly decided to continue the war. The Roman army once again crossed the Euphrates.
The army once again crossed the river, and after this, the leader ordered the bridge destroyed so that, as he said, none of the soldiers would return back.
These words made a gloomy impression on the army.
Not explain what he meant. After crossing, the commander faced a choice. He could either move south along the river, which would thereby reliably cover the armies.
He could either move south along the river, which would thereby reliably cover the army's right flank. Then, having reached southern Mesopotamia, the army could turn east and, in one dash, reach Seleucia. The second option was proposed by the supposed Roman ally, Abgar. He assured them that the Parthians would not dare fight the main Roman forces and that
their eastern adversaries would not dare fight the main forces, and that they needed to hurry deep into the country so that the spoils would not escape their grasp. They needed to hurry deep into the country so that the booty would not escape Crassus. The Parthians, he said, intended to move their treasures to the
where reaching them would be much more difficult. Unexpectedly, a third option was also proposed. In the camp appeared the regal leader. In the Roman camp appeared the Armenian king Artavasdes, who persuaded Crassus to invade Parthia from the north through the Armenian Highlands.
In the mountains of Armenia, the Parthians could not use their heavy cavalry. Cataphracts, shock-heavy cavalry, armored from head to toe in scale armor. In antiquity, such detachments were armed with long spears, kontos, up to 4 meters in length, which were held with both hands.
В длину, которые держались обеими руками. Но командир уже принял фатальное решение для себя и своей армии.
But the Roman commander had already made the fatal decision for himself and his army to march through Mesopotamia into the heart of the country. The Roman army moved to relieve its garrisons besieged in cities by the Parthians. Scouts began bringing strange reports. The Parthians everywhere were lifting the sieges of cities and disappearing in unknown directions. Crassus hesitated and decided to convene a war council.
At it spoke his quaestor Cassius, who proposed stopping.
We must halt the advance, General. The supply lines are stretched too thin.
As the young strategist spoke, he proposed stopping in one of the cities occupied by their forces until reliable information about the enemy was received. The middle-aged man believed that the enemy was fleeing and decided to pursue them. In reality, a cunning officer had been sent to lure him east.
Enough talk. We ride out now. Sound the trumpets and break camp.
As you command.
As possible, and he successfully accomplished his task, after which he disappeared. The May heat stood oppressive. The army marched at a forced pace and was beginning to suffer from heat and thirst. Although the desert had not yet begun, the leader, hoping to quickly catch the enemy, pushed the troops with relentless marches, leaving them little time to rest. The troops with long marches without giving them time to rest. But days passed, and the enemy was nowhere to be seen. Crassus began to grow nervous. Finally, after many days of exhausting marching, when the army had just passed the city of Wang, by a Roman garrison, several scouts returned and reported that all their comrades had been killed, and that a huge enemy army was rapidly advancing in hopes of catching the Romans by surprise.
Alarmed by the news, the commanding officer hurriedly began deploying the army into battle formation. Alarmed by the news, the commanding figure hurriedly began deploying the army into battle formation. At first, on the younger man's advice,
a possible flanking maneuver. However, an army stretched in a marching column for 21 kilometers could not quickly form a battle line 12 kilometers wide.
Form square! Move into position now! Close the ranks!
by the gods, move! Form the square! Close ranks, cohorts!
3 legions remained in reserve behind the square. He entrusted the flanks to the lean man and his youthful companion, while taking direct command of the center himself.
Advancing in this order, the Romans approached a small river. Most officers proposed setting up camp, resting and moving against the enemy at dawn.
But the decisive officer made another decision. But the leader made another decision. Having satisfied hunger and thirst while remaining in formation and without giving the troops. rest, he led them forward without stopping until they strenuses. At first it seemed that there were few nomadic warriors, and that they did not look very impressive. By order of the nomadic commander,
prepare the charge!
By order of the Parthian commander, a resolute woman in battle attire,
Their heavy cavalry had covered its arms
with cloaks, and the main forces were hidden behind the advance riders. The total number of the Parthian army was around 10,000. At last, Crassus' dream had come true. The enemy no longer avoided battle, but on the contrary moved toward the Romans. The enemy no longer avoided battle, but on the contrary moved toward the Romans. But then the surprises began. A dull rumble of Parthian drums sounded, having a depressing effect. When the Parthians discerned the depth of the cohesion of the soldiers, they retreated backward and, pretending to scatter in confusion, secretly encircled the Roman square. Crassus ordered the lightly armed warriors to rush at the enemy. But before they had run even 100 meters, they were met by clouds of arrows. The Parthians simultaneously began shooting arrows from all sides from a distance. The Romans stood so densely and tightly packed that it was difficult even intentionally to. Crassus understood too late into what trap he had fallen. Roman heavy infantry, powerful in hand-to-hand,
an army composed entirely of cavalry. The commander and the other leaders tried to maintain the soldiers' morale, encouraging.
Crassus and the other commanders tried to maintain the soldiers' morale, encouraging them. The Roman commander also attempted to advance the cohorts against the enemy, but the archers were continuing to shower them. The Romans finally noticed camels looming in the distance, bringing new supplies of arrows to the Parthians.
From time to time, groups of horsemen approached, circling around. Finally,
the commander decided to break this terrible ring surrounding his army. He ordered his son to take the cavalry, 500 archers, and 3,000 infantrymen, and at all costs. When the detachments separated from the square and rushed at the Parthians, they hastily turned their horses and fled. Soon, both disappeared beyond the horizon in clouds of dust. The pressure on the main Roman forces noticeably weakened. The commander seized the moment and withdrew the army to a nearby elevation. Considering the battle over, he calmly awaited the return of his son.
However, messengers from Publius soon reported that Crassus' son was in danger.
Messengers from a nearby leader soon reported that the commander's son was in danger, urgently requested reinforcements, and would inevitably be crushed if help did not arrive in time. Meanwhile, another horizon. The Parthians, fleeing from the younger Crassus, suddenly turned around and rushed at him. The Romans stopped combat. However, the Parthians, surrounding the Roman force with cataphracts, again unleashed their mounted archers. Although the Roman cavalry bravely attacked the Parthian cataphracts in place, and many Roman horsemen performed miracles of courage in hand-to-hand fighting, and they struck their light, short spears against metal armor, while themselves receiving blows from the heavy Parthian lances and exposed parts of the body. Having lost nearly all their horses in the attack, the remnants of their wounded commander. Seeing a sandy hill nearby, the Romans withdrew there and formed around it. But on the elevated ground, all sides remained open to the deadly arrows. Finding himself in an absolutely hopeless position, the son of Crassus found a truly Roman way out. According to Plutarch, Publius was accompanied by 2 Greeks from the nearby city of Carrhae. They urged him to secretly flee with them.
You must flee with us, secretly, to the city. It has sided with the Romans. But he refused such shameful escape.
To their nearby city that had sided with the Romans. Unable to use the hand pierced by an arrow, the son of Crassus ordered his shield-bearer to strike him with a sword. to strike him with a sword. Following their commander's example, the other Roman officers also committed suicide. The remaining soldiers continued fighting.
Also committed suicide. The remaining soldiers continued fighting. The Parthians captured about 500 men alive. Then, cutting off the heads of Publius and his officers, they immediately rode to Crassus. They immediately rode to their leader. Meanwhile, the army saw the warriors returning. The leading rider,
and the army shuddered. But the general did not lose heart even now. Right. The death of my son concerns only myself. You, meanwhile, must fulfill your duty and repel the new enemy attacks.
The cataphracts and mounted archers on the flanks again enclosed the Roman formation in a semicircle. Once more, archers on the flanks again enclosed the Roman formation in a semicircle. Once more, a rain of arrows fell upon the Romans. While the armored cavalry advanced in wave after wave against the Roman square. With the onset of darkness, the Parthians withdrew, shouting to the Romans that they granted Crassus one night to mourn his son. The leader one night to mourn his son. And during the night the leader, who had energetically commanded throughout the battle, his officers, on their own initiative, assembled a war council, which decided to immediately retreat to Carrhae, abandoning 4,000 wounded men whom the Parthians later killed. The army marched and reached the city of Carrhae, where a Roman garrison stood. In this city, the army could rest and return by the same road by which it had come. It did not want to leave the city. Therefore, the war council decided to request assistance from the Armenian king Artavasdes and wait for it in Carrhae. And after receiving it retreat through the mountains of Armenia. When Surena learned that the Roman army When a cunning strategist learned that the Roman army together with a prominent general was in Carrhae, he attempted to destroy the Romans. While in Carrhae, he attempted to destroy the Romans through trickery and offered the soldiers free passage on the condition that they hand over their leader to him. It was subtle. If the mutinous army fulfilled this demand, then dealing with a crowd of soldiers deprived of their commander would be easy. However, Roman discipline still remained. Soldiers deprived of their commander would be easy. However, Roman discipline still remained too strong. The enemy's treacherous demand was rejected. The Romans marched out at night, when the Parthians preferred not to fight. The enemy preferred not to fight. The general decided to go by the mountain road. Through the distant land, choosing the swampiest places where the enemy could not move their cavalry. The commander lost his influence over the command staff. The first to separate from him was his officer. He returned to the base. The first to separate from Crassus was his officer Cassius. He returned to Carrhae.
The first to separate from the middle-aged man was his officer. And from turned.
And from there, with 500 horsemen, safely reached Syria by the previous road. Crassus's second officer, Octavius, and together with 5,000 soldiers, found safety. Crassus himself was overtaken by daylight among the marshes.
Only 2,000 infantrymen remained with him. Here they were discovered by the pursuers, while only 2 kilometers
remained to join Octavius. The Romans retreated to the nearest hill and prepared for battle. The soldiers retreated to the nearest hill and prepared for battle, but unexpectedly help arrived. The leader with their legion rushed to their comrades' aid. The Romans surrounded their commander and shielded them with their shields.
Of courage by the soldiers. Meanwhile, Surena, accompanied by senior officers, rode up to the hill where it had fortified themselves.
We propose a truce!
The hill where the Romans had fortified themselves, and on behalf of the Parthian kingdom proposed concluding a truce.
And discussing its terms. Fearing an ambush, the leader, who now considered retreat secured, refused and began consulting with his officers. But the soldiers, taking the offer at face value, lost patience.
We demand negotiations with the Parthians, Crassus! You've endangered us all! We won't die here for your pride! Negotiate now!
The enemy, and then began insulting and even threatening the general with violence for throwing them into battle against those with whom he himself did not dare negotiate. Then the general, them into battle against those with whom he himself did not dare negotiate. Then the leader, accompanied by several officers, descended from the hill toward the warriors. Further, accompanied by several officers, descended from the hill toward the Parthians. Further events could not be reliably reconstructed.
Events could not be reliably reconstructed.
Crassus and his officers were killed. Crassus has been punished as he deserved.
Says as he deserved, and that the rest could come down. Some believed him and surrendered. Others attempted to escape during the night but were destroyed.
Attempted to escape during the night but were destroyed. Ancient warriors, only a few survived. According to legend, the rivals poured molten gold into the mouth of the dead commander, mocking his greed. The severed head of the commander was into the mouth of the dead nobleman, mocking his greed. The severed head of the nobleman was thrown at the feet of the regal king, thrown at the feet of the Parthian king. From the time of the defeat at Carrhae, vengeance for Crassus became one of the most popular slogans in Rome. However, Roman attempts to cover Crassus became one of the most popular slogans in Rome. However, Roman attempts to realize this idea ended unsuccessfully. The Roman Parthian border for centuries stabilized along the Euphrates. The system of Roman-Parthian dualism in the Middle East was destined for
relations along the Euphrates. The system of Roman-Parthian dualism in the Middle East was destined for a long life.
Later it was inherited by the Sassanids, who in the 3rd century replaced Parthia, and on the other side by the Byzantine Empire. It began to collapse only in the 7th century AD, during the time of the Great Arab conquests. Thus, the confrontation of the civilizations of East and West in Western Asia, ultimately ended in favor of the East.